Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Greg Bowman. I have the honor and privilege of serving as the Dean at Roger Williams University School of Law in Rhode Island, and we're so pleased to welcome you to today's Integrating Doctrine and Diversity Speaker Series event. We have a great program for you today, and I'm going to start us off by reading our law school's land and labor acknowledgement. So as we begin, we want to take a moment to reflect on the lands on which we reside. Roger Williams University School of Law's Bristol campus is located on the ancestral and traditional lands of Indigenous people. Together, we honor and we acknowledge the Narragansett and Pokanoket nations as the original stewards of this land who lived on it, governed it, and cared for it long before the arrival of European settlers. We also recognize that the foundations of this country were built through the forced labor of enslaved African people. The town of Bristol, including the land upon which our campus stands, was significantly shaped and enriched by the transatlantic slave trade. We acknowledge this painful history and its enduring legacy, and we honor the resilience, knowledge, and cultural contributions of the African diaspora whose labor was exploited through systems of violence and white supremacy. Thank you very much for being here. I look forward to the program. Nicole, turning it over to you.
Thanks, Dean Bowman. Thank you all for being here. In sort of the spirit of bell hooks in teaching to transgress education as the practice of freedom, bell hook states, the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. Part of what allows the discussion in classes to be at times safe and at times brave is academic freedom. Today, we will discuss academic freedom within the context of the now, which is sad, which is difficult, sometimes threatening, which is sobering, which is scary, but which is also hopeful and important. The now is where we are all still teaching classes, attending classes, and integrating doctrine and diversity. Today's speakers are Dean Erwin Chemerinsky, Dean of and Jesse H. Choper, Distinguished Professor of Law, UC Berkeley Law, Dean Danielle M. Conway, Dean and Donald J. Farage, Professor of Law and Anti-Racist Development Institute Executive Director, Penn State Dickinson Law, and Dean Johanna Kalb, Dean of the School of Law at the University of San Francisco. So if you all want to put your cameras on, this is more of a conversation than an interrogation. My first question is for Johanna. Well, I usually start with some type of explanation of where we're at in this current moment. You have summarized the lay of the land, at least as far as the lay of the land went in 2023, in your article, Renewing Educational Autonomy. We're going to share that in the chat. In that article, you discuss an Idaho statute and describe that it is part of an unprecedented trend of state actions seeking to fundamentally reshape the operations of American colleges and universities, inside and outside the classroom, calling into question the relative autonomy that these institutions, whether public or private, have long enjoyed. The protections of academic freedom, as they have been instantiated in the First Amendment law, are proving inadequate to protect our colleges and universities from these type of incursions. This is because in its current incarnation, academic freedom serves primarily as an employment protection for faculty in their teaching and research, excluding from constitutional protection a wide variety of educational decisions made outside this scope. The message of the current movement, however, is that the teaching and scholarship we produce are inseparable from the communities we build that make those activities possible. So can you bring it to present? how might you update for this description for where we are in late 2025? And has the role of government changed in the past few years? And how would you describe that change?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nicole, for organizing this. And I'm really honored. I've been a participant before in this series, and so I'm honored to be a part of it and with my distinguished colleagues. So when I wrote this article, I was the dean of the University of Idaho's law school, and as I sometimes say now, everywhere is Idaho now. I think at the time that I wrote, we were seeing, really serious attacks on academic freedom and just on higher education more generally within some states, and Idaho was certainly one of them. Now, as we all know, the federal government is brought its power and its power of the purse to bear and kind of on some of these same issues. And I'm sure Dean Chemerinsky can speak to that, to our, behind some of these very similar objectives. And that's made, I think, the situation even more fraught and more destructive. So at the time that I was dean in Idaho, we'd have these state statutes, but then we would have federal directives that were often in conflict with the state statutes. And while that made compliance really difficult, it also gave us room to maneuver and to negotiate. Now that the federal government is endorsing many of these same initiatives in attacking our research institutions, most recently in the compact that was announced, that was very clearly an effort to sort of trade academic freedom and autonomy for federal funds. We're really, I think we're in a situation that is even more tenuous and much more frightening even than it was before.
Before I ask the other two Deans to jump in the same article, you wrote, quote, current debates about the governance of American institutions of higher ed echo debates about the role of colleges and universities dating back hundreds of years prior to the nation's founding, end quote. When I read that, I was sort of wondering, how much is the conversations we're having now about sort of the sky is falling outlook, this is the death of academic freedom, democracy, whatever. How similar is it from the past? Are the issues we face today regarding academic freedom in law schools and beyond mostly the same or vastly different than what we have faced in periods in the past?
Yeah, so it's a really great question, and it's something I think I'm spending a lot of time thinking about. I find reading history to be very comforting in this moment, actually. So I would commend that to anyone who is feeling like the sky is falling. There are things about this moment that are unprecedented, and I don't want to minimize what we're going through in any way. At the same time, we have been in very dark times and higher education. And when I was writing this piece, I was sort of looking back to even the pre-founding era, and it is true that there have been these arguments about academic freedom, threats to particular institutions, battles between legislatures and faculties dating back to the founding. The McCarthy era was really a terrible and frightening time, where lots of the themes we're seeing now, it looks a little bit different, but also similar, sort of anti-intellectualism, challenging educators as being unpatriotic and un-American for the work that they do, targeting vulnerable groups. For, obviously we have a long history of exclusion in our institutions, and I'm sure my colleagues are going to speak to that as well. And so I guess, in those moments, one of the things about the McCarthy era is it led to strengthened academic protections because of the work that happened on the ground. And so I worry always about the sky is falling framing, because it feels like there's nothing we can do. And I actually think we're already seeing, courage, we're seeing mobilization, we're seeing new alliances being built. And I think we're also seeing a reckoning with why we're vulnerable in this moment. And so I think these moments challenge us to think about how do we articulate our value in higher education? Why do things like academic freedom matter? Why do universities matter? And I think we've seen in prior moments like this a real kind of energy around articulating answer to those questions, and we're seeing it now, and I think that's really hopeful. So I want to. The sky may be falling, but I think there are things we can do about it, and things that are already happening.
That was the most positive way that we could have started the discussion off. And my guess is we're not going to stay this positive the whole time, but I hope that we can approach the conversation with that level of sort of love and respect for history, where we've been and where we're going. Can I add Danielle and Erwin to the conversation? If one of you and then the other one of you want to jump in and like share on this issue.
Danielle, do you want to go first? Or you want me to go first?
Thanks, Erwin. I just found the unmute button. I appreciate that. And I'll be quick with this. I think Johanna hits it right on the head of that nail. We, number one, have to stay positive, but also in the context of administrators, we stand in the breach. And so we have to be there to also talk about the standards that guide us in our programs of legal education. We have to give meaning and interpretation, for example, to Standard 208. We also have to give meaning in this time of politicization to educational innovations. And you mentioned bell hooks and creating and co-creating classroom experiences. And so maybe one way to do this is to do that educational, innovative jujitsu and have different ways of teaching. So you're going to ask me some questions in my section, but I'll just give you a precursor to that. Just what you're doing with integrating doctrine and diversity, taking clips from various presentations from noted scholars like the people on this call, Johanna Kalb and Erwin Chemerinsky. Those can be the things that speak for us so that we get those viewpoints in that classroom and also speak to the next generation of students. So I'll stop there. Erwin, you go ahead.
Let me also say how wonderful to be part of this conversation and to be with Johanna and Danielle. I really like how Johanna phrased this. The sky is falling, but we have to fight back. And there's hope that if we fight back, we will succeed. I do believe this is an unprecedented moment in American history. We went through the McCarthy era, but what happened in the McCarthy era wasn't led by the President of the United States. It wasn't led by the President's cabinet in the same way. Just recently, a professor at the University of Arkansas Law School was fired because of speech. Last year, we had a professor at LSU Law School fired because of speech. This is reminiscent of the McCarthy era, and it's not that law schools are separate from what's happening. I also agree with Johanna that in some ways, what we're seeing now is the continuation of the anti-CRT, anti-DEI legislation that was adopted in many states. The legislation still exists. That legislation is being challenged. But I do think we have to put what the Trump administration is doing in a different context than that, because it is the federal government. I think it's important to emphasize that what the federal government and the Trump administration is doing goes far beyond the law. Take, for instance, affirmative action. Students for Admission versus President and Fellows of Harvard College in 2023 said that college universities can't engage in affirmative action. But it didn't say they can't pursue diversity through other means. The Trump administration is interpreting that case far more broadly than what the Supreme Court said. Nothing in that case says that college universities can't use proxies to achieve diversity. The Trump administration expressing that's not permissible. Chief Justice Roberts' opinion specifically said that colleges and universities can look to admission statements to see how people overcame adversity or found inspiration. The Trump administration is explicitly saying that's not permissible. So I think it's important that we keep in mind how much further it's going than the law. And I just want to say, what the Trump administration has figured out is that American universities have three financial vulnerabilities, and they're going after all of them. One is they're very dependent on federal money. And so what you've seen is cutoff of grants to researchers. You've seen cutoff of grants to some universities. And one area of cutoff of grants is grants that are perceived as facilitating DEI. The Trump administration did a word search and simply cut off grants that used words like diversity. So in a lawsuit that I'm involved in on behalf of UC faculty and researchers, one of our plaintiffs was doing work on plant diversity and had the grant cut off. Another was doing work with regard to the environment of the human stomach in terms of diversity, and that grant got cut off. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars being cut off, billions of dollars now of grants being cut off of research. And we have to fight back against it. And I'm discouraged that universities aren't doing this, that there's lawsuits being brought on behalf of faculty and researchers. Second, they realize that universities are very dependent on foreign students. It's true of law schools for programs like LLMs. It's true of my law school. Harvard University, 27% are international students. One part of the terrible compact that was proposed would have capped international students at a university to 15% and no more than 5% from one country. Third, they realized that universities are dependent on philanthropy. So for the most elite universities, the big budget bill that was passed includes a new tax on endowments. And I can't talk about that bill without talking about the way in which it has eliminated the Grad Plus student loan program, capping student loans at $50,000 a year. Tuition, even at many public schools like mine, is much higher than that. What's that going to mean in terms of accessibility? And what will that mean in terms of diversity? So I put all of this together to try to convey, well, yes, I am optimistic we can fight back successfully. It is an unprecedented moment and a very dangerous moment for higher education, for academic freedom, and for our commitment to diversity.
I think one of the things that sort of bubbles up from all of your comments is that we need to be looking for the courageous and for the innovative, and we need to sort of keep up. I think the word fight is wrong, but we need to keep up the fight, for lack of a better word right now. And, we need to keep looking forward, and we also need to not only discuss it, but do it. That there needs to be action intention behind, and not just words. Danielle, in August of 2022, you wrote, state-sanctioned punitive memory laws amount to self-serving attempts to apply self-exculpatory legislation to protect states from criticisms of systemic racial inequality. Apart from doubling as political theater, dangerously so in the wake of January 6th, the use of punitive memory laws deprives historians, citizens, residents, journalists, and minoritized people the right to challenge constructed histories in some cases and flagrantly false redemptive histories in other cases. Moreover, memory laws create a tension between the principles of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and academic freedom on the one hand, and the policies, processes, and procedures the government seeks to promote on the other. The tension escalates when memory laws include punishment. This feature creates a chilling effect on individuals and institutions who would otherwise seek to engage in open debate in furtherance of a pluralistic society. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the chilling. Have you seen or heard from faculty where free speech has been chilled? If so, are you able to share the advice you give to colleagues, and how do the current state of challenges to academic freedom, how does this all relate to memory, truth, democracy, and the ideals of our foundational legal documents?
I know that's a mouthful, and thank you for putting the op-ed article in the chat where that's written. The impetus for that really sat in the aftermath of Nazi Germany and those punitive memory laws. So that's a really good example of what we mean by punitive memory laws. How do we change the history to reflect better on a government and not a negative aspersion on that government? And so giving us narratives to think about how we rethink, reframe histories. So that's to position you in that paragraph. Do I have faculty who are concerned, and administrators and adjunct faculty and professional staff who are concerned about the chilling effect of the Trump administration's executive orders, the compact that Erwin referenced, the assault on critical race theory, the assault on LGBTQIA, the assault on any number of out-group people and organizations? Yes. Faculty are, and I use that term very broadly, those who teach. Faculty are very concerned, and they should be. Erwin mentioned people who are being fired, people who are being censured, even by the universities that have policies relating to freedom of expression, freedom of association, and academic freedom. And so what I try to talk with my colleagues about with the chilling of speech is, number one, we have to practice it internally. And so by practicing it internally, it gives us courage to practice it externally. We have to know the bounds and the limits of academic freedom. We have to know the difference between academic freedom and freedom of expression, because those two things are very different. And what I try to talk about with executive leadership, those who are in administrative positions, is that the academic freedom that we are practicing internally and exhibiting externally is not without bounds. It's about accountability and it's about responsibility. And so we should be narrating that to people who think somehow we have run amok in higher education, that there are not these bounds on freedom of expression and academic freedom in our institutions, and that it's the ethical rules, the ethical responsibilities, and the accountability that we should also be discussing so that we all stay on a level playing field about the facts. And my article was about the significance, the vitality, the ever importance of facts and working with each other to actually do the fact gathering and fact interpretation before we even start launching into what our analyses are, what our viewpoints are. So those are the things that I try to discuss with colleagues.
I love that. I just want all of us to think about when we became teachers, how much education we got on academic freedom and where we got that education from. And is it now worth, this is such a heightened issue and there's so much misinformation. I mean, we're in a climate of misinformation, period. But there's so much misinformation. Is it not worth starting internally, having education or discussions on academic freedom, trying to all get on the same page before we move forward? Because I think that that would be helpful for particularly our junior faculty, or our staff that teach who might have like less access to some resources. I want to continue, Danielle, the political polarization is real. And we see this in our class discussions, we see it on social media, we see it in our student groups. And I still have to go out and teach every week. What advice do you have for educators and administrators who are actively every week trying to facilitate discussions, encourage class engagement and participation, but genuinely afraid of unpredictable, disrespectful, or overly political class discussions?
So the audience that this question is directed at may not like what I presaged in my earlier comments. It actually means spending more time with students. It's spending more time with colleagues. It's engaging in the kind of trust building that we need and the innovation in teaching and learning that we need. So I talked about having different innovative ways of approaching the teaching exercise. Well, it would be interesting to spend time with students before classes. As you review the syllabus and say, what clips have you viewed? What articles have you read that actually bear on the topic of the syllabus? I'd be interested in that as the leader in the class, the teacher and learner in the class, to see what it is that you find connects to the syllabus. And could we curate or co-curate a particular approach to discussion, especially if the topic is controversial? So how can we do some of that presaging work? And then in those smaller conferences say, look, you may not agree with everything that I put together or that I get from another student, but how can we meter this so that we can have outcomes that we achieve from this? And so, that may seem scripted, but, some of the best teachers in the teaching and learning classroom are those who perform and have a script and sort of know what those outcomes are going to be toward the end of the class, but also doing recaps in those classes and saying, here's what we got from this, here's what we got from that. What your role is now is to think about how those two things are, like I say in the article, how are those two things in tension? And let's talk about that tension, or let's experiment with that tension outside of class. What more can you bring back to talk about that?
I think it also it really brings back Erwin's comments about SFFA in that we are calling people into the classroom to show up as their authentic self with what they have read, what their life experience has been, what their position is. And we're asking them to come with that and then engage with us instead of closing ourselves off from that. And it might be more work, but ultimately we might have more inclusive classrooms even through political polarization. Erwin, what advice do you have for educators and administrators who are trying to protect conservative student voices and well-being in a law school, which is generally leaning more progressive? Or more generally, how do we provide spaces and support for our students who find themselves in a political minority in the school of their choosing?
Thank you. I think it's about messaging, facilitating, and modeling. And let me say a word about each of these. I think messages really matter. And so I send a message out to the law school community at the beginning of the school year that expresses our commitment to being a place where all ideas and views can be expressed, as well as stating our First Amendment policy. And I try to explain to the students why it's so important that we be a place that all ideas and views can be expressed. I've now taken at my orientation talk to first-year students, explaining to them why they benefit from hearing all ideas and views. Because if nothing else, as lawyers, they need to know the arguments on the other side. And I've become increasingly concerned that it's social pressure among the students, often over social media, that silences voices, and trying to explain to them why they lose by that happening. There are certainly instances over the course of a year where I might need to reinforce the message about our commitment that all ideas and views be expressed. But now to take it to the level of a teacher, I spend much more time in the first class session of each course that I teach, talking about wanting this class to be a place where all ideas and views can be expressed. And I'm teaching this semester criminal procedure and next semester constitutional law. And those are classes where I want to hear that diversity of views. But I think the message our communicating as administrators and faculty that this is what we want is important. Second, we have to facilitate it. And so it may be that we have to do more to invite conservative speakers to the school if there aren't student groups or centers to do that. It may be in the classroom that I have to spend much more time playing devil's advocate to make sure that I'm facilitating all of the views coming out. But I don't think we can assume it's going to happen on its own. And the question is, how do we create platforms as deans within the school or as professors within our classrooms? And finally, I think modeling is really important. I've often thought that the most important thing I've done as a parent for my 4 children isn't what I've said to them, but how I've modeled behavior for them. And I think what I do is often much more important than my words. Well, we as administrators and we as faculty members then have to model the behavior that we expect for our students, which is about respectful discourse. It's about listening. It's about being a place where all ideas and views can be expressed.
I love those comments. I also sort of bring up cancel culture in class, and I ask them the question, what are you afraid of? And I don't like make them raise their hand and say, I'm afraid that my friends are going to not be friends with me, but I invite them to think about it. What are you afraid of? And how can I as a teacher, help with that? And maybe I can, and maybe I can't. I do think social pressure is real, but if you can name it, then there's a better chance that we together as a group, or at least me as a teacher or part of a teaching cohort, can sort of work to overcome that. If I'm not aware of it, I can't always work on it effectively. But Johanna, I know you wanted to jump in on this question, and then Danielle, if you also want to jump in, please feel free to do that. Johanna first.
Thank you. I agree with so much of what both Danielle and Erwin shared about their strategies. And, what I would say, I've been at 2 very different institutions with very different sort of makeups. And before that, I was at Loyola New Orleans. So I've been in lots of different places in the country with different student populations. And I think, in my experience, when crisis tends to happen is often when there's a population of students who don't feel like they have representation or a voice. And so I think that the work that we do as administrators, as faculty, but I think about it in my dean role, it really requires us. I mean, I love what Danielle was saying about pre-work, and I think that's true with everything. It's making sure that we have representative student groups, even if it means that we actually have to do a little bit more work as faculty or as administrators to make sure that those groups are available, so that when new students join, they find a community that they feel like reflects their views. In Idaho, I spent, you can read my bio and you can kind of probably make some guesses about where I am on the political spectrum, but I spent a tremendous amount of time with student groups that held views that were different from me. And I worked really hard with them to help make sure that their activities were supported and that they had good ideas for speakers. I made suggestions about bringing speakers and highlighting different things that they were doing, so that it didn't feel like the fact that I was who I was meant that they had different access to the resources of the law school. I think making sure that all of our students understand that we're invested in their success, regardless of where they sit on the political spectrum, can help to head off some of the tensions and some of the crisis. I think it's hard to ask our students to show up as their authentic selves. I love what you said. When I was teaching at Loyola, I would often ask students to take particular positions that weren't, so that they didn't have to carry the weight of carrying that position, so that they got the ability to start talking frankly about the different sides of really controversial cases in constitutional law. And what I found is, over time, students were more likely to disclose their own views once they've experienced the classroom as a place where these different views were accepted and where we debated them and the trust was built within the classroom. But allowing them to separate themselves, in part also because our students don't always know, right? They show up. And I talk a lot about that too, that this is the law school, both in my orientation speech and in other places, that we want you to change your mind here. Like, that's the point. We want you to engage with people who are different and come out of here with a different and more nuanced view. And so I'm not expecting you to have your take on affirmative action right now or abortion or other controversial topics, because I'm hoping that the experience of being here in the community is going to change it. The last thing one of my colleagues at Idaho did, I thought, a brilliant thing. We had students in orientation draft their own code of conduct for how they wanted to engage with each other and treat each other, and we were able to then use that and rely on that later. When crises happen, we were able to point back to it and say, look, when you didn't know your colleagues and you didn't know where they thought, what political persuasion or what religion they had, this was how you wanted to be treated and this is how they wanted to be treated. So let's see if we can kind of come back to it. But I just think what both Erwin and Danielle said about time is so important. I think these jobs as deans used to be different. And now, and I think as faculty, it used to be different. Like, our students need more from us in almost every single way we can imagine. And so I think for folks who are entering the profession or people who've been here for a while, like, really thinking hard about that. If loving that, I think, is pretty crucial to being successful right now in this space. And it may not always have been, but they need so much from us. And so I think we have to be people and hire people and support people who put and promote people and give people tenure who are willing to put the time in with students. And if in our institutions are not valuing that, then we're not valuing what our institutions and our students need to be successful right now.
I really appreciated that. I think one of the things that came up for me was also us having a community. The people who are doing the work need a community to talk about how to do the work better. I can't always say to students, like, how do you think I should have approached this? Because it's not really their job to do the work. It's my job. But what I have found, particularly in my own institution, but also at the ADI, the Anti-Racist Development Institute at Penn State Dickinson Law, is a community of people who are going through the same thing. And that has been so powerful to me. I also had that in law librarianship, that we have a community. The other thing that really I reflected on when you were speaking was about how even the idea of changing your mind is politicized. And so we have some extra work to do to say, just set this. Changing your mind is not only okay, it is expected, maybe even required of you as you learn to think like a lawyer. And so, we have to let go that might be a bad thing or might be weakness, and instead we might see that as strength. So thank you for bringing that up. Danielle, did you want to add anything to this, or shall I move on?
So I'll add quickly that, and I see a couple of questions in the Q&A. I think one of the roles of a dean should also be myth busting, if you will, because in that myth busting or stereotype busting, you prepare students to see you differently. Now, I obviously read as a Black woman, right? But students, especially last year during our Second Amendment symposium for the law review, just could not believe that I was expert at firing weapons, right? That was part of who I was. And so the assumptions that they have, that is not part of my image, my persona, is a myth busting. And then if you can take those myth busting opportunities and then analogize them to the historical context that you want to critique. So for example, I love Carol Anderson's work. Somebody's asking in the chat, what are Dean Cobb's history books? So I love Carol Anderson because she talks about the history of enslaved Black people and newly emancipated Black people not being able to access weapons and what that meant to their protection. So if we can make these historical and factual connections with people who think that they are very different than we are, then that's a win. And, people for some reason don't put together 27 years of military experience with a recognition about the importance of arms. So I love to myth bust. I love to stereotype bust in connecting with students.
Thanks, Erwin, and then sort of all of you. I want to ask the other side of that question, if you all feel like you want to weigh in on this. How do we advise students who may feel compelled to protest the free speech of others on campus? What are the limits specifically? How do I think about this as a teacher or someone who is a professor who supports student groups? And when I was doing some reading on this, I ran into the heckler's veto and how Erwin, do we inform our campuses on how to avoid free speech, which then curtails the free speech of others?
There is no right to use speech to silence others. There's no First Amendment right to use speech to shout down people so that they can't be heard. Otherwise, the only speech we'd hear is that which no one cares enough to try to shout down. So again, following the kind of things I was talking about before, I think messaging is important here. I think for institutions, careful planning is important here. And I also think enforcement of policy is important here. So in terms of messaging, part of the message that I sent at the beginning that I mentioned is very explicit. There is no right to disrupt an event at the law school. If you do that, you will face student conduct charges. If you dislike a speaker, protest without disruption, bring in your own speaker, but you can't come in and shout down or disrupt something. Second, because we've had so many incidents of this at Berkeley, unfortunately, it takes a lot of careful planning. So when we have controversial speakers, we always have a senior administrator there. There is always a statement that's read at the beginning. If necessary, we have security officers there. And if necessary, we have campus police there. But my advice to deans is your best effort should be to try to prevent the disruption. Once the disruptors are in the room, your ability to control what happens is very limited. And so we've taken much more to restricting events to those from the law school or the campus community because of disruptions from people outside the law school. We've taken to requiring that people register and show IDs to come in. It doesn't prevent all disruptions, unfortunately, but what we've discovered is if the disruptors are in the room and there's a significant number of them, even if you have campus police there, they're not going to be able to preserve order without disrupting the event even more. I wish we weren't in a world where we had to talk about it, but it really does take very careful planning. And third, it takes enforcement. If there's a rule, it's meaningful only if it's enforced. And if we're going to have a rule that says, if you disrupt, you face consequences, then we have to impose that. We unfortunately had an incident in September where there was a disruption, and we did have to turn over to student conduct the name of the student who shouted so much the speaker couldn't be heard. We did have to turn over the organization that instituted that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to be punitive, but I do think it's the only way of protecting the free speech of all. I constantly tell my students, the only way my speech will be protected tomorrow is to protect the speech that I don't like today.
I love that. And I would just echo, and informing our staff, our faculty, and our students on this is the way to go, because we can't follow rules we don't know. So as I was preparing questions for you all this week, I was talking to my colleagues near and far, and a newer professor on the tenure track asked me to ask you all, what impacts the struggle over academic freedom has had and will have on newer law professors And more widely, what about the impacts on our students? And anybody can go in whatever order they.
I'm happy to tee it up with the question or the comment I said earlier. And so I think that we have to do a lot of work, pre-work, with our faculty, whether they're new or whether they are wise and have been here years, about how academic freedom has evolved, especially as higher education has evolved, and who was in higher education when academic freedom was at its zenith, and think about who's in higher education now when academic freedom is under attack. And to Erwin's very important point, protecting the speech today is about also protecting the speech tomorrow, and recognizing in that history that there were some of us who were never even permitted into the academy to exercise academic freedom. And there are remnants of that inequity that currently sustain themselves by virtue of the hierarchy, the status quo, and the various statuses in our legal education enterprise. And so we have to talk about those things and address those things before we even come to an understanding of the attacks on higher education now, using an attack on academic freedom, using the attacks that we are overly progressive or leftist, and being ascribed certain viewpoints that I just talked about, doing some myth busting around. And so we have to have those conversations internally so that we are ready and able to meet the assaults that are not based in fact today.
Let me add then to what Danielle said. We haven't yet defined academic freedom. And I think it's important that we keep in mind academic freedom isn't the same as the First Amendment. I always describe freedom of speech and academic freedom in a Venn diagram sense of overlapping circles. But what academic freedom does is protect the freedom of faculty in their scholarship and research to express their views, protects faculty in the classroom and what they express and how they teach, and it protects faculty in the dissemination of ideas. But it's not unlimited. Like free speech, there are limits upon it. With regard to academic freedom, it's professional standards. So if one of us as deans assign someone to teach contracts, and the person says, I'm not going to teach contracts, I'm going to protest, and I'm just going to talk about sports every day, academic freedom doesn't protect the ability to do that. If somebody is in a history department or they're a Holocaust denier, I would say academic freedom doesn't protect their ability because it's not within the standards of the discourse. I think that people understandably have concerns for academic freedom now. I think my undocumented students have every reason to be fearful. My international students who are on visas have reason to be fearful. We can't deny those fears. We have to think about what we realistically can do to protect them. And when I learn of the University of Arkansas professor being fired for a comment, or when I heard last year of the LSU professor being taken out of the classroom because of a comment, we see that the threat to academic freedom is real. So my answer to your question is that I think we as deans collectively have to speak up and be the voice for academic freedom in law schools. And we as deans, with regard to our own schools, have to do everything we can to protect the academic freedom of faculty. Now, the reality is, being at Berkeley, my faculty has much less to fear with regard to academic freedom than they would in states, especially states that are adopting things like the anti-CRT laws. But we have to be a voice for academic freedom for all in the profession.
I don't have a ton to add. I agree with what's already been said, and I think what both Danielle and Erwin are pointing to in part is this, the definitional concerns, right? I think that's so important, and I think we're gonna talk in a minute about this about the ABA standards, but I think the concept of academic freedom is defined in lots of different ways. It's now being contested, but going back to the beginning, I think what Danielle said is being clear amongst ourselves in our own communities, in our professional community, is incredibly important right now, so that people understand what we can stand up for and what are the things that are outside the bounds and what is protected and what's on the line, so that folks can make their own decisions. I also just think that this is a moment. There's a couple questions about the responsibilities of deans in the chat, and I think this is a moment for all of us that tests our courage. And so I think having the conversations with ourselves, with our loved ones, with the people around us about kind of how far we're willing to go and what we're willing to risk, I think is really important. Some of what I experience, Erwin talked about the ways that the federal government is doing things that are unprecedented, directed by the president. And I think some of the reactions that have happened in our field were people caught off guard because it was so different and they hadn't really thought about what would I do for rule of law? What would I do for academic freedom? And so they made choices that they maybe didn't want to make or maybe regret. And we all know that we're under attack. And so I think figuring out now, when is the point when you say, I'm not willing to do this, I will step down over this, I will go to, if you're going to go after that faculty member, you're going to lose your dean, or et cetera, et cetera. I think figuring that out is really important so that we make the right decisions. And unfortunately, I wish we weren't in a moment that required so much personal introspection and courage. But I really do think it's necessary now.
So I heard this come up several times in questions that people asked you, but that people asked me to ask you all. But what advice do you all have, anyone can answer, for those who may have found themselves on a watch list? Are faculty hiring committees checking the watch list? Are students checking the watch list? Do we need to be concerned?
Okay, I'll just step up. Oh, Erwin, great, step up.
Go ahead, Danielle.
I would say, in a feat of realism, it would be surprising to me, of all of the paper and the work that appointments committees have to do, that they would be seriously checking watch lists. I think that there's so much that goes into the appointments process that I just don't even physically think it's possible. But at the same time, I think it's important to do those reference checks and to do that background work that we have consistently done. Those are the things that are going to set us up for success. Penn State University has a very strict policy of background checks. And so that is the administrative function. And I believe that that is where those checks should happen.
At one point, my name appeared on one of these watch lists, and I got several emails from students saying, did you know your name is on this watch list from some conservative organization that's labeled you a threat? I admit I took it as a matter of pride that my name appeared on the list, but I also realized that I'm a tenured professor and I'm not in a vulnerable situation. I don't know how I'd feel. Probably it depends on where I was teaching. Again, there's such variety of law schools, such different places. No, of course, Berkeley doesn't look at watch lists and hiring. I haven't heard of law schools looking at watch lists, but I wouldn't be surprised that there are some states that where the appointments committees do, where the universities do, where there's pressure from the legislature to do. And then I think what's crucial is responsibility for all of us as deans collectively to stand up for academic freedom and those who might be targeted, and for the dean of that particular school to do so. This is a time when it's going to require courage, but we should expect that of people to stand up to protect those whose names appear on watch lists or things like that.
I'll just say no from my experience at two very different institutions. There was no looking at watch lists. It did not come up. That said, I totally agree with what Danielle says about, you want to have a process, like from the other side, from the school side, you want to have a process so that if you hire a faculty member and that person is on a watch list, you can say, this is the process we went through. This is this person's scholarship, their teaching, like this is what they're going to come do here, so that you're able to articulate the reasons why this person will be a valued member of the community. And I think doing that work is really important. But I also, I totally agree with Erwin, like the challenges are really real, really, really scary. And so I think, I think people themselves need to be really thinking about, I would never discourage anybody from thinking about the moment that we're in and thinking about where you live and where you want to live and what your career goals are, and acknowledging that ending up on one of these lists in some ways may have very real impacts on your ability to do the work. And that's where, knowing yourself and knowing what lines where you're willing to bend and what lines you're willing to cross and when you're willing to compromise and when you're not, and which speech you want to be fired over and which speech you don't want to be fired over, because it isn't, I think that's the reality that we're in right now. And so we have to be smart. We have to be courageous. And I am a huge fan. And we also have to be smart and strategic about our choices. And sometimes I think the fact that we've been so safe and so protected for so long has lured us into a sense, some of us in higher education, to a sense that we're invulnerable. And that was never true. It's not true now. And so making smart choices to protect academic, I think we can also do work to protect academic freedom, to not do things that are really on the boundaries that are in a way that is negligent and not intentional. And by that, I mean making offhand comments versus writing important scholarship about abortion or critical race theory, right? So think about your dean. Think about what you want your dean to go fight the legislature for, and what you want them to stand up for in your choices. Like we're all in this together, and we need to make smart choices together to make sure that we protect what really matters in this moment.
Thanks. I think those answers were really helpful for people who are really scared for right reasons or wrong reasons, and are sort of trying to make this calculus about jobs to take, where to teach, what to say. But I want to point, so this question is for Johanna and Erwin. I want to point to the AALS Law Dean's Clearinghouse on Academic Freedom and Free Speech, where the two of you are both project leaders. Can you share a bit about this project and how the tools there might be helpful for any of us in the academy, even beyond law schools, to sort of figure out where to plant our feet?
Sure, I'll start. And so the project had a lot to do with the new ABA standards and figuring out how to help schools think about developing them and enforcing them. And I think one of the things that we all worked on the project was gathering feedback from deans and their faculties that when the standard came out, about the areas where there was inconsistency and lack of clarity, and so we were able to, I think, provide a really useful information to the council, which resulted in another guidance memo. And so in addition to that, what we've been doing is collecting information for schools that have already, we should all have these policies in place, but we've been able to collect some sample policies to help schools as they think about that. And so that is sort of some of the collection of resources that we've put together. What might be the most, so I think some of it is this definitional thing that we've referred to a few different times on the call, helping us as a collective of law schools really pin down academic freedom, free expression, what is protected under each, and for whom. And so I think that is a helpful resource as you think about trying to, within your own communities, trying to have the conversations that we've talked about here. The other thing that I think is maybe even more helpful is that the group of people who are listed are all on the website, are all people who've struggled with this in different contexts, in very different ways. I mean, Erwin talked about some of his experiences. You can Google me and you can find my experiences. I mean, and so, we're all available, I think, and we want to be available because the pre-planning how you're going to deal with a difficult situation, I think my colleagues have emphasized that, and being able to talk to someone who's in a similarly situated place, who's had the kind of challenges that you've experienced, is a great way to kind of think about how to do that pre-planning around, or to navigate a situation that you're in and you're struggling and you're not sure who to talk to. And so I think, I don't want to speak for all of us, but I will, because I think all of us would be more than willing to receive outreach from a dean or a faculty member or administrator who's feeling like a crisis is emergent and needs somebody to talk to about how to navigate it. And if we personally haven't done it, we will refer you to somebody else who has lived through it. We're a very collaborative community, and we really, we want to help and support each other. And yes, I'm 100% with Erwin on we need to get together. And when there's a crisis, we all need to get together and publicly support. But if we can avoid those crises by helping ex ante, I think that is better all the way around. And I think we're all available for that.
I think, again, the note of community. I also, and that's sort of where my hope lies. My hope lies in community, and also to remind all of us who are law teachers that we are also lawyers, and we are capable of intentional thought. We are capable of, exploring context and history. We are capable of moments of advocacy, even if it's self-advocacy, and also to be able to sort of manage a situation that maybe has gotten out of control or could. All of these things are in the like sort of typical lawyer wheelhouse. So sometimes it's reaching out, and sometimes it's sort of looking within ourselves to say, like, look, we got this. Even if I've never been in this exact situation, I am ready to meet the moment. But I want to end on like hearing from the three of you. Where are you finding hope right now that you can share with all of us who need it? Erwin, why don't you start?
Sure. Thank you again for including me. It's been wonderful to do this, Johanna and Danielle. I'd say I find hope from two things. First, I find hope from history for just the reasons Johanna said. The country has been through terrible times before, and we've gotten through it. And often the response has been to make things better in the future. I think of the abuses of power of the Nixon administration and all the laws that were adopted after that. I truly believe that what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said is right, and that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. And I think we will get past this. And the other thing that gives me hope is my students. My students are so idealistic. They're not optimistic at this point in time, but they are so committed to using law to protect people, to advance justice. And so I'm constantly inspired by them, and that gives me hope.
Johanna, what gives you hope that you can share with us today?
I have so many sources of hope. It's funny, like I am both, this is such a hard time, and I wake up and I look at the news and wish I hadn't. But I think that the coalitions, the communities you're talking about, give me tremendous hope. I'm so grateful to be in a community of deans that cares so much and is so supportive, and we're all working to support each other and our students. I mean, it's a really tremendous place. I would say the same thing about my students. I tell my students, like, you are the resistance. You are exactly what many of these laws are trying to stop. And so the fact that you're here, the fact that you're learning, the fact that you are changing the face of power in this country, that is my hope. That gives me chills every time I say it, and I say it a lot because it's true. And my colleagues whose jobs have all gotten so much harder for all the reasons, but who are staying in the game, who aren't leaving, who are doubling down, who are, like I said, their jobs have changed in so many ways because our students have so much more need, and they are leaning into it and finding joy in it and finding inspiration in it. I think all of that pretty much daily gives me something happens that gives me a real burst of hope.
Thank you for that. Well, Danielle, can you finish us out with your characteristic truth and hope?
So what gives me hope is this collective and our coalition that we have built. What gives me hope is my 14-year-old last egg who makes life so meaningful and makes me know why we are in this contestation, this current contestation. But last and not least are my ancestors. I am a Black woman through and through. And when I look back at my history that I cannot point to, frankly, directly, I can point to historically, it gives me hope that I am here. I have made it here, and I've made it against every odd. So what gives me hope is that I have people who know that, who see it, who acknowledge it, and who want to make the future better. And those are the people in our law schools.
Well, that is a way to end a conversation and to move forward into the world. Thank you to our speakers. Really, it took months just to get an hour where you all were free. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you to the administrative professionals who did the months-long work to get us all in one place at one time, even virtually. Thank you to RW Law, the Anti-Racist Development Institute at Penn State Dickinson Law, CUNY Law, Berkeley Law, and Juris, who all help co-sponsor the Integrating Doctrine and Diversity webinar series. And thanks to the people behind the scenes you don't see, Kara, Addie, and Chelsea, who help with all the tech. And finally, last but not least, thank you to my own dean, Greg Bowman, who kicked us off and helped support this work at Roger Williams here in Bristol, Rhode Island. We'll see you all at the next Integrating Doctrine and Diversity.